We'll begin by summarizing the basic shaklavataria of the Gemara, discussing the din of kamcha dechiti. In the very definition of what kamcha dechiti is, and we'll return to this by Ezra Hashem, there is a machlokes harishonim. Tesis dibra maskal kamcha dechiti says deloi mairi bekamcha mamish. It can't be talking about eating just plain flour made from chitim. Certainly on that Tesis says there'd be no possibility of the bracha of ber pri hadam. And presumably the reason for Tesis making that introductory statement to the sugya is because, as we'll see in the Rif, that raw kemach, unprocessed kemach, the Rif says is entirely not derech la'ichlai. The Rif's lashon is kamcha dechiti. The Rif says the lo regile inshe l'sefuye kamcha. It's not usual for people to eat kemach plain, and therefore, presumably, Tesis says the sugya can't be speaking about eating kemach of chitim plain because that's not derech la'ichlai at all, and therefore the bracha would, by definition, be shehakoil. And there'd be no place for Rabbi Yehuda's shita that says that kamcha dechiti should remain a ber pri hadam. And therefore, Tesis goes on to say, Elomayri bekamcha shekorim ishklotir. It's talking about kemach, which is called ishklotir, and kemach that's called ishklotir, as we'll see later in the Rishonim, means it is a form of broken up or crushed chitim which had previously been roasted. And therefore, that is derech la'ichlai, and hence there's a possibility for the shita of Rabbi Yehuda that the bracha should be ber pri hadam. So therefore, to summarize, the case of kamcha dechiti is a machlokes harishonim. Tesis says the case cannot be speaking about kemach plain of chitim. It must be speaking about kemach that's processed. Whereas the Rif says clearly that kamcha dechiti is referring to kemach plain. And we'll return Be'ezra Hashem to the shita of the Rif as we go through the sugya. The Gemara then brings the machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda Omar ber pri hadama, Rabbi Nachman Omar shakol nia bidvarai. Now, the Gemara begins by saying that what makes kamcha dechiti unique is that the bracha on ordinary chitim, had they not been turned into kamach, the bracha is a bracha of ber pri ha'adam. And Rashi says immediately that the reason why, according to Yehuda, the bracha should be ber pri ha'adam, Rashi says, keshar koiseis chitim, the sanya lekamon, shemevorech ber pri ha'adam. Rashi later on defines the term of koiseis. On Lamed Vavam and Beis, Rashi says, the definition of the term koiseis, Rashi says, is kol davar sha'adam oichel shaloi kedarkoi mikre kesisa. Anything that's not eaten in its usual form is called kesisa. And therefore, Rashi establishes that the premise of the sugya is that the discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman about whether the bracha of kamcha dechiti should be ber pri hadam means we are addressing an instance where the kamcha dechiti is being consumed shaloi kederach, similar to kaisis chitim, which is also an achila that's not kederach. But nonetheless, says Rashi, in the same way as kaisis chitim, eating chitim in the raw, the bracha is ber pri hadam. Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that despite what the Gemara calls ishtani, that the chitim have undergone a transformation, still the bracha remains ber pri hadam. And that Rav Nachman counters, and Rav Nachman says the reason why the bracha becomes a shahakoil is because of ishtani. It's because the chitim have been transformed into kemach. And the Gemara then goes on to the shaklavataria of Rava. Omar Rav le Rava le Rav Nachman le tifla galei Rabbi Yehuda. Don't argue with Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the bracha remains ber pri hadam, because we find in the case of shemen that the bracha remains ber pri ha'etz. the same as if one would have eaten the zayis itself. Alma, says the Gemara, afagav the ishtani b'milsekoi, even though it has been transformed from chitim into kamach. And chitim, as Rashi says, the bracha would be bar pri adama. Kaisis chitim is bar pri adama. The bracha for kamach should remain bar pri adama in the same way as the bracha for zaysim is bar pri ha'etz. But when transformed into shemen, despite the transformation, the bracha remains bar pri ha'etz. That Rav Nachman counters, and the Gemara says, Midami, Hosam lesle iluya achrina, shemen doesn't have an additional ilui, Hocha isle iluya achrina bepas. So to summarize the content of the Shakla we begin with the base bracha, which should be a bar pri hadama, because kaisis chitim, despite the fact that it's an achila shaloi kedarka, the bracha is bar pri hadama. Chitim, though, have a characteristic of ishtani, which means chitim have been transformed from chitim into kamach. The transformation allowing the retention of the original bracha or changing the bracha depends on ishtani li'iluya. And then the question is, do we consider that because kamach has an iluya achrina, does that therefore mean that the ishtani, which is not for the ultimate iluy, because it has an iluy achrina bapas, therefore the bracha is not comparable to shemen, and the bracha should not be the same bracha of kaisus chitim? Or do we say afal gav the ishtani b'mil seikoi, despite the ishtani, the chitim retain their original bracha of bar pri hadama? Rabbeinu Yoina makes it clear that there are two issues that the Gemara is having a Shakla Bataria about. One is, does the ishtani create ishtani leiluya or does it not create ishtani leiluya? Namely, does iluya achrina b'pas mean that this is not the final iluy of chitim and therefore it's not comparable to shemen? Or can this be considered sufficient iluy? But Rabbeinu Yoina says that in Rav Nachman we see two chidushim. First of all, we see that it doesn't retain the bracha of bar pri hadama necessarily, but what we also see is its bracha is denigrated, so to speak, that it no longer can retain even its original bracha, and it becomes a shahakal. So the two chidushim in Rav Nachman. First of all, that he does not consider kaises chita as having an ilui through becoming kamach, and Rabbi Yehuda considered this as an ilui equivalent to shemen. But then Rav Nachman is going on to be mechadish that not just this is not an ilui, but it's actually a greyus on the bracha, that the bracha becomes then, so to speak, demoted to the bracha of shahakal. In other words, in shemen we see, as we learned in the Shakla V'Tarya on Daf Lamed Hey with Beis, that shemen has a bracha of bar pri ha'etz because it's ishtani li'iluya, and therefore it maintains its bracha of bar pri ha'etz. Yayin, even though it's ishtani li'iluya, has an additional chashivus of bracha. So we see that ishtani li'iluya doesn't necessarily mean that the bracha changes to a bracha that's more chashuv. Ishtani li'iluya can mean that it maintains the bracha. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that chitim are ishtani li'iluya when becoming kamach, it exactly parallels shemen, that shemen is ishtani li'iluya and maintains its bracha bar pri ha'etz, and because it's not soid, it doesn't gain the bracha like yain does. And so too says Rabbi Yehuda, it's ishtani li'iluya, and the bracha of kamcha dechiti is the bracha of kaisis chitim, namely bar pri hadama. In Rav Nachman, though, we see, as we mentioned, that not just is it not ishtani li'iluya, that it can be equivalent to shemen, but it actually is considered inferior in some way to kaisis chitim, and the bracha becomes a bracha of shahakal. And the question is, why is that? It's perhaps kedai to see the lashon of Rabbeinu Yoina inside, where Rabbeinu Yoina explains clearly these two parts of the Shakla V'Tayr of the Gemara. This is a very basic nekuda in
we
the
can put the Rabbeinu
sugya
Yonah on.
itself.
There we go. Let's
As we
see.
mentioned in the introduction, Rabbeinu Yonah, there is a basic machlokes harishonim. Apologize. What the case of the Gemara is referring to? Is it referring to
Page before.
kemach,
Page before.
ordinary kemach in the raw, or are we referring to kemach made from koloyos? Tosfos' shita is that the kemach is made from koloyos. The Rif shita is, as we'll see later in Rabbeinu Yonah, that we're actually speaking
Scroll a
about.
little bit more down.
We're actually speaking about kemach made from chitim itself. We had mentioned that the reason why Tosfos rejects the possibility that the Gemara is talking about raw kemach is because if that would be true, the bracha would be shehakoil, because that's not the usual way in which kemach is nechal. It's an achila shaloi kedarka. The Rif, amazingly, says that we paskin like Rav Nachman that the bracha of kamcha dechiti should be shehakoil because it's not the derech to eat kamcha dechiti. So Rabbeinu Yonah then asks a basic question on the Rif, and he says in the middle of the Rif, the second highlighted area. The Rabbeinu Yonah asks on the Rif, and he says, if that would be a valid reason that achila shaloi kedarko would therefore necessitate that the bracha should be a shahako, so why didn't the Gemara say that? Says Rabbeinu Yonah, va'oid the Reb Nachman gufei loy omar shahako mitam she'ein b'derech b'nei adam la'achloi. Reb Nachman himself never invoked that reasoning of the Rif, that the reason why the bracha should be shahako is because it's not usually eaten. The imke devreim, according to the Rif she'poiskim l'kulam mizeh hatam, that the Rif paskins that the bracha should be shahako. Hoya loy Reb Nachman loymar midomi. How can you compare to shemen? Chosam derech uleechol shemen al dei anigroin aval kimcha in derech b'nei adam la'achloi. In other words, Rabbeinu Yonah is asking on the Rif if a determining factor in the bracha being shahakol is because it's ein derech la'achloi. We don't find any mention of that in the sugya. So Rabbeinu Yonah then suggests a yishuv for the Rif, and he says the following. He says, "Ve'eshel ataretz, we can answer this question on the Rif, and we can suggest the hochi ka'amar. This is what the Gemara means. Ein ledamoisam zuluzu. We can't compare kamcha dechiti and shemen. The hossam, in the case of shemen, less lui achrina, hossam is lui achrina batas. Therefore, says Rabbeinu Yonah, ve'yotzam michlal hadin harishoin shekoivei brocha chashuva yoiser, va'afilu hochi kol zman shelo higia la'oiser ilui, hoyil vu gorua achshav al yidei hashinui she'enoi roi la'achila mevarchim olav shahakol. Zot Rabbeinu Yonah, the Gemara is addressing one issue, and the Rif is addressing a second issue. The Gemara is addressing the issue of why the bracha of kamcha dechiti is not the bracha of kaisis chitim. And on that, Rav Nachman is saying that the reason why is because it's undergone a shinui. And it's shinui which by definition changes the bracha from before. And therefore, the bracha cannot be the bracha ber pri adama because it's undergone a shinui. Now the Gemara is addressing a second question. Now that it's undergone a shinui, and the bracha is not going to be, by definition, the bracha of ber pri adama that chitim had in their original form. Now comes a second question: Is the chitim ishtani liluya? That the Gemara is saying that according to Rav Nachman, it is not yet ishtani liluya because it has an iluya achrina, and therefore it can't be parallel to shemen. And because it can't be compared to shemen, it won't have the bracha of ber pri adama like shemen has the bracha of ber pri eitz. That's all the discussion of the Gemara. That is a discussion of ishtani and ishtani li iluya. But now there's another question. Given that it's not ishtani li iluya because it's isla iluya achrina, why now is the bracha shahakoil? Why should it be less than the bracha of ber pri adam? As we'll see, Rashi addresses the question at the end of the Gemara and has his own answer to the question. But the Rif says for that we don't have a answer from the actual wording of the Gemara. The reason why the bracha should be shahakoil and should be less than the bracha of kaisis chita is because, and that's what the Rif is suggesting, says Rabbeinu Yoina, that because in this present state, einoi roi la'achila, hoyel vu garua achshav al yidei hashinui she'einoi roi la'achila, therefore mevarchim alav shahak. So what we see from Rabbeinu Yoina, to summarize, is that there are 3 steps in the establishing the din of kamcha dechiti. And even though Rabbeinu Yoina is establishing this in the Rif, the structure and the form that the Rabbeinu Yoina gives to the Gemara is universal to the Rishonim. And that's the following. The assumption is, to which all agree, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman, whether the bracha is Ber Pri Adam or whether the bracha is Shahakoel, that chitim have undergone a transformation of ishtani. And therefore, kamcha dechiti is not the same as kaisis chita. Now, when something undergoes a shinui, we then have a question. If it's ishtani li'iluya, it will have the bracha Ber Pri Adama, like Shem and Zayis, where it's ishtani li'iluya, it has the bracha Ber Pri Eitz. Whether it's ishtani li'iluya or not, that the Gemara is discussing, and that's the subject of the machloikes of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Yehuda holds because it is nishtani li'iluya, despite the fact that it's iluya achrina, the fact that it has an iluya achrina doesn't detract from its present ilui, and therefore because it has a present ilui, it's then comparable to shemen. Whereas according to Rabbi Nachman, its current state is not a state of ishtani li'iluya because it has an iluya achrina. But now the question is, even if it doesn't have presently a state of ilui, but why should the bracha be shahakoel? Let it be, again, like the bracha of kaisis chitim, namely that despite the fact that tishtani, it's still a form of a ber pri hadama. As we'll see, Rashi answers that question by saying, because it's lost its status of pri, and we'll come back to that lashon of Rashi. But the Rif doesn't invoke that svara, and the Rif says that now we have to add an additional reasoning, which is not mufurish in the Gemara, and the reason why it's brachas shahako and it can no longer be ber pri hadama is because it's ein derech la'achle b'kach. So the point which we then take from Rabbeinu Yoina is that the Gemara is discussing 2 separate issues. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman are discussing ishtani and ishtani li'iluya. And the question is, even if we arrive at the conclusion that it's not ishtani li'iluya presently, because it's ishtani li'iluya achrina, why then does that necessitate that the bracha is shahaka? To which the Rif gives an answer of shaloi kederech achila, and Rashi, as we'll see, gives the answer that it doesn't have the status of pri. So therefore, we've established that in the Gemara, we now have 2 nidonim, ishtani and ishtani li'iluya, and whether, despite the fact that it's ishtani and not ishtani li'iluya, why does the bracha then become the bracha of shahaka? This is the basic structure of the sugya. So, mufurish in the Gemara, we have the issue of, is kamcha dechiti comparable to Shem and Zayis, benegea to the dinim of ishtani? So the kulei alma, it's ishtani. Then we have a question: is it ishtani li'iluya? That's the machloikes: is isle iluya achrina or lesle iluya achrina? Now says Rabbeinu Yoina, despite the fact that isle iluya achrina, that doesn't necessarily mean that the bracha should be downgraded, so to speak, to a shahako. So that we need an additional svara of either the Rif of in the achila bekach or Rashi, because it doesn't maintain the shame of the pri. This is the basic shaklavataria of the Gemara. We'll now go on to ask a number of basic questions on the shaklavataria of the Gemara, and from there try and establish a yesod in the bracha of ishtani, in the klal of ishtani li'iluya and isle iluya achrina. The Marik in Sherish Mem Gimel makes an introduction to the sugya. And he says that by the mere fact that the Gemara made a comparison and drew a parallel between the din of kamcha dechiti and the din of shemen, that must mean that kamcha dechiti has the status of ishtani li'iluya. And the only question is that despite the fact that it's ishtani li'iluya, is it isle iluya achrina, or we don't consider that the svara of Isla Elui Achrina. But that it has been transformed in a way that could be categorized as Ilui, that's not the question of the Gemara. This is the Hakdama which the Marik makes to the Sugya. If we look on the supplementary Maramakomas, top right-hand side, the Marik is discussing the question of the halacha of in what's called in confetu or confiture, which in French is jam or fruit jelly, fruit preserves. And he's discussing the shaila if grapes are cooked into preserves, what the bracha is on that confetu. And he says, Kivan the ishtani liilui. The question assumes that by cooking the grapes, one has accomplished ishtani liluya. So the Marik continues, and he says,
Yeah. What do you mean? We do not see you now. Just switched off. But we heard the voice. Let me find out what's happening here. With some stomach your side. No?
The connection went out from where Deutsch was.
Is the Wi-Fi strong enough?
I'm trying to reach Chaim.
I don't know if Chaim's probably back in his session. He won't be available.
Oh, okay. So
are you in the office, Rav? Are you in the office somewhere?
I'm in one of the conference rooms in the hotel.
Should be strong enough. Mordechai, tell everybody to hold on a second. We'll come back on.
Okay, as you heard Rabbi say, we're trying to reestablish the connection from the convention conference hall where Deutsch is broadcasting the share. Please bear with us. Thank you.
Rabbi Shapiro, would we want to have them call in, and then we could at least
No. Basically, let's try to see if we can get back the video. Usually, I can't imagine the Wi-Fi in the hotel is not good enough. So let's try to get out again, and let's try it 2-3 times as we do it. Otherwise, if all else fails, then we'll do an audio. We also need the screen sharing here. Is Chaim picking up or Mordechai?
No, he's not picking up.
He's probably in the middle of that session there. Is everybody still on? Everybody hang on here for a minute or two. It's a bandwidth issue, obviously. And then we'll, doesn't work, we'll default down to Pesach Seitza. The fact that we have this on the screen doesn't mean anything, right? Mordechai?
Well, what do you see on the screen?
Here's the Rav's back. We see the screen sharing. That's from our side, right?
Yes.
Okay, here's the Rav. Okay. The mic is off.
All right, we'll turn it on.
Rav has to turn on the mic.
Okay, can I be heard now?
Yes.
I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened. The Marik goes on then to say that however, these preserves that don't have any form of hanovim, the raya and the proof for that is mikamcha dechiti. The Omer of Nachman, the mevarchim olav shahakol mishum dechoyel v'ishtani. Therefore, the Marik says that the very shinui itself serves as a reason why the bracha should be shahakol. So the Marik says, don't say that the reason why in the case of the chitim is because the chitim have not been transformed in a form of ilui, and that's why the bracha is shahakol. Says the Marik, that's not true. The Hamaksha Rava Ladivri of Nachman, the Omar Shahako, Mishem and Zayis, the Mevarchim Olav Bayer Prihaitz. Rav Nachman, the Rava asks and says that the bracha of cases of Kamcha Dechiti should be the same as Shem and Zayis. And the only answer to that is Hosam Isle Iluya Achrina, Aval Hocha Isle Iluya Achrina Dea Pas. Mashma di Ishtani li Iluya. So the Gemara has never reversed that assumption that Kamcha Dechiti is Ishtani Leiluya. Elo the Isle Iluya Achrina, just it has a further Ilui. Tilav Toimar Hachi, because if that assumption wouldn't be correct. Tilav Toimar Hachi, if that assumption wouldn't be correct, Lomo Leilamema Mishum Iluya Achrina, why does the Gemara have to dismiss the parallel to Shem and Zayis by saying it's Iluya Achrina? Leimalei, he should simply say, Deloidomi Hosam Gabi Shem and Zayis Ishtani Leiluya. Aval hocha lo ishtani leiluya, ela hocha vadet ishtani leiluya, ela de is leiluya achrina mashein ken b'shem and zayis. What's the Marik proving from our Gemara? The Marik is proving that despite the fact that kamcha dechiti are ishtani and are ishtani leiluya, the bracha is still shahakoil because of ishtani itself, which means, says the Marik, that were there not to be the issue of Ishtani, then Einochanami, the bracha would remain a bracha of Bayer Pri Hadama. Because it's Ishtani, the bracha then becomes Shakol. Because the bracha becomes Shakol, from there we can prove a general principle that wherever something is Ishtani, by definition, its bracha becomes reversed or downgraded to the bracha of the bracha of Shakol. Therefore, says the Marik, in the case of the fruit preserves, the anovim that have been transformed into jelly, in that case, the bracha will also be a bracha of shahakol because it's ishtani. As long as it's not ishtani li'iluya, which the Marik goes on to explain why it's not ishtani li'iluya, ishtani itself by definition means that the bracha is denigrated to the bracha of shahakol. Now let's understand for a moment why that is. The Rif explained that the reason why the bracha is denigrated to shahakoil is because it's not derech achila bekach. But that's not correct in the case of the Marik's fruit preserves. In the case of the Marik, of course, it's derech achila to eat the anovim in the form of preserves. So what is it, according to the Marik, that justifies that the Gemara assumes that just because it's ishtani, the bracha can be denigrated? Rabbeinu Yonah explained that because of ishtani, Adarabba, ishtani means either li'iluya, that it should be a bracha like Shem and Zayis, or it has to be ein derech achila bekach. But why, according to the Marik, in the case of preserves, does ishtani alone denigrate the bracha? And we mentioned that the answer to this before lies in Rashi, where Rashi says, Rashi says, Rashi then establishes a yesod in the sugya, different to the Rif, that ishtani by definition means that it can no longer retain its original bracha of Bar Priya. And the reason is because yotza michlal pri. It has lost its status of a pri. And then Rashi goes on to say, u'lichlal derech achilosoi lo iba. Were this to be the usual form in which kamcha dechiti would be eaten, that would be its ilui. And that's what Rashi emphasizes, that the reason why shemen can retain the bracha of Bar Priya is because lekach not uhu hilkach prihu, says Rashi, because the zayis was planted for the purpose of shemen zayis, and we'll come back to that swara later. But what's relevant for us at this point in the sugya is that Rashi says what allows the bracha Bar Priya is, despite ishtani by shemen, it has the shem of a pri. So what we learn from this Rashi is, and that's the basis of the tshuva of the Marik, which then clearly has a very broad nafkamina lahalacha. And as we'll see later in the shir, and Be'ez Hashem we'll learn further in the sugya and daf lamed ches, that's the basis of the machlokes harishonim in the sugya of trima. Trima means pulverized pri, where there is a machlokes harishonim if the pri has been pulverized to the extent that it no longer has any form of pri whatsoever. Can the bracha still be Bar Priya 8? Or, as Rashi Shita is, the bracha then by definition becomes shahakol. So this machlokes harishonim has its root in our sugya. Until this point in the sugya, before we see the Marik, Rabbeinu Yonah says that we have two issues to resolve in the sugya: whether there's ishtani iluya, and therefore it should be considered like shemen, and why the bracha is downgraded to the bracha of shahakol, which the Rif requires a svara not mentioned befurish in the Gemara. And therefore the Rif is mechadish the svara of lav derech achila. Says the Marik, that's not Rashi Shita. Rashi Shita is by definition, the moment something is ishtani, it can't retain its bracha. And therefore the bracha by definition should be different than Bar Priya. And therefore, according to Rashi, the reason why it's a shahakol is discussed in the Gemara, because the reason why it's a shahakol is inherent to the very concept of ishtani. So this basic nakuda in the sugya of how to understand why ultimately for Nachman the bracha shahakol is shani b'machloikes. According to the Rif, ishtani alone doesn't necessarily mean the bracha is going to be shahakol. And as we'll see later, the Netziv will point out that this is the Rif L'Shitosoi, that in the sugya of trima, that even fruit that's pulverized to the point that it's not recognizable, the original form of the fruit, doesn't necessarily mean the bracha shahakol. Whereas Rashi holds that once a fruit is pulverized to the point that it's no longer recognizable and doesn't retain its original form, the bracha by definition becomes shahakol. So Rashi's sugya is a sugya of ishtani, and ishtani itself by definition says the bracha can't become a bracha of Bar Priya 8. It's ishtani. The Rif says there isn't such an assumption. Now, therefore, we'll have to understand, according to Rashi, and this is what we'll get to as we continue in the sugya, is if that is correct, that the basis of the Gemara is that ishtani by definition detracts and the bracha becomes a bracha of shahakoil. So what's the logic of Rabbi Yehuda that it has an ilui and therefore retains its bracha? And what would therefore be the difference if it's isle ilui achruna or less achruna? Ishtani itself denigrates the bracha. Now, before we discuss that basic question, let's now set out a number of shilas in the Gemara. As we mentioned, the Marik, as we just saw, establishes that by definition, kamcha dechiti is considered ishtani liluya, but the issue is isle ilui achrina or less ilui achrina. We saw in the lashon of Rabbeinu Yonah that Rabbeinu Yonah and Shitas Rif has the same assumption. Rabbeinu Yonah says mefurish that in the Rif, kamcha dechiti is ishtani and should really necessitate a bracha chashuva yoser. The reason why it doesn't have a bracha chashuva yoser is because it's ein derech achila, and therefore it becomes downgraded to a shahakol. But according to all the Rishonim that we've seen to this point, Kamcha dechiti is by definition is considered ishtani liluya. Now, if that's correct, then how do we understand the statement that Tosfos makes later on the Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph? On that Gemara of Kaises Chiti, which we said was the assumption of our sugya. Dahainu, that Kaises Chita is a hadama, and the question is whether or not Kamcha dechiti has the same bracha. Tosfos says that Kaises Chita has a beri pri hadama. Shaharei, afilu bekamcha dechiti amrinu le'el mavarchim ala beri pri hadama. We see that the shita of Rabbi Yehuda is that even Kemach can have a beri pri hadama, and certainly, therefore, Kaises Chita should have the bracha beri pri hadama. And even though Rav Nachman argues, says Tosfos, that's only because it's ishtani. So now, Tosfos has made a kol shekain in the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. If we see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that Kamcha dechiti has the bracha beri pri hadama, kol shekain Kaises Chita. Now let's understand. Maybe the reason why Kamcha dechiti has a beri pri hadama is because it's ishtani liluya. But Kaises Chitim in their raw form, maybe their bracha is shahakol. Tosfos seems to have made an assumption that Kamcha dechiti should, by definition, downgrade the bracha of Kaises Chita. Why should that be true? Maybe la'olam, the reason why Kamcha dechiti is a beri pri hadama is because Kamcha dechiti is an ilui, whereas chiti themselves, which are legreusa, don't have the bracha beri pri hadama. And Tosfos seems to be saying our Gemara and the Marik from the Pashas of the Gemara says the exact opposite. Kamcha dechiti is ishtani liluya, and therefore its bracha should certainly be, like Rabbeinu Yonah says, a bracha that's meshubach yoser, whereas Tosfos here seems to be saying the exact opposite, that if Kamcha dechiti has a bracha meshubachas, then kol sheken Kaises Chita should have that bracha. There seems to be a stira to what we established from the Marik in Shitas Rashi and Rabbeinu Yonah. Secondly, the Rif has established that it's not derech achila to be oichel kamcha dechiti. So therefore, we're left to the basic question: why therefore is kamcha dechiti ishtani liluya? What makes it ishtani liluya? How could we create something which is less derech achila than Kaises Chitim and still call it ishtani liluya? How could that be? Besides those two basic shaylas in the Shitas HaRishonim in the Sugya, namely, once the Marik and Rabbeinu Yonah have established in the Gemara that Kamcha dechiti is certainly ishtani liluya, how that's consistent with Tosfos on the Lamed Zayin, that seems to draw kol shekain the opposite way. And the question that we're asking, how can the Rif say that it's not derech achila, and at the same time, the Gemara is mefurish that it's considered, according to the Marik and Rabbeinu Yonah, it's considered ishtani liluya. Let's ask some basic shaylas on the shakla v'tara of the Gemara itself. The Gemara proves afal gavdi ishtani b'milsekoi, that despite the fact that kamcha dechiti is ishtani, the bracha should still be beri pri hadama. Where do we see that from? Says the Gemara, we prove that from the din of shemen. Now we'll recall that shemen, that its bracha is beri pri ha'etz, is a statement of the Amoraim on the Lamed Hey Amud Beis. So why can we ask a simple question? And this is the tzlach's kushiat suma on the Gemara. The Mishnah says that yayin is ishtani liluya and has a bracha of beri pri ha'etz. So frek the tzlach, why invoke a halacha that's said by Anamoira, which we could certainly say is Reb Nachman, is polig gavra karomis, as the Gemara asks, bring a raya from the basic din of yayin that even though it's ishtani, its bracha doesn't revert to a shahakoil. If we're trying to prove that ishtani retains its bracha, and Rabbi Yehuda is going to go on to say that the kamcha dechiti, like we said from the Marik and Rabbeinu Yonah, the Gemara always knew was ishtani liluya, and we need additional svaras why the bracha should then become a shahakol. So prove the concept of ishtani liluya from yayin. What does the Gemara find in Shemen, which is a chiddush of the Maharam, more than the basic premise of the Mishnah? This is the kushya atzuma of the tzach. Secondly, the Gemara says, in introducing the Svar of Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara says, "Afa gavdi ishtani b'milsei koi," even though it's been transformed b'milsei koi, its bracha should still be the bracha of kaises chita. Why is that the point? We said, as the Marik emphasizes and as Rabbi Yehuda emphasizes, that everyone agrees in the Gemara, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman, that kamcha dechiti is ishtani, and it's ishtani l'ma liyusa. And the only question is leilu yachrina or less leilu yachrina? So why, therefore, does Rabbi Yehuda say that afal gavdi ishtani b'milsei koi, the bracha should be to retain the bracha, the baseline bracha of kaises chitim? Why is that the point? Rabbi Yehuda should simply say, the reason why it's very kamcha dechita b'yuda and very pri hadama, the reason is not because afal gavdi ishtani b'milsei koi. The answer should be afal gavdi ishtani liluya. Why b'milsei koi? Why is that the point? There's a simple machlokes if it's ishtani liluya, or because of islay liluya achrino, like Rabbeinu Yonah said, it's not considered yet ishtani liluya. Why b'milsei koi? Why is that the discussion of the Gemara? So to summarize, we had two basic questions on the premise of the Rishonim. That how could kaises chitim be ishtani liluya? Kaises draws an opposite kol shekain from kamcha back to kaises. How could we say that kamcha dechiti is considered ishtani liluya if the Rif clearly says it's shaloi kederech achila? And two general questions on the Gemara: why the Gemara didn't prove from the principle from Yayin and had to prove it from Shemen, which is only a din of Amiroim. And secondly, why is the Gemara discussing afagav ishtani b'milsei koi if the discussion is a discussion of ishtani liluya or lo ishtani liluya? The mahalach that we'll suggest in the Gemara is based on a point which we touched on when we learned the sugi of Yayin, and we'll now come back to expand on that nekuda. And that is, what is the definition? How do we define the concept of ishtani liluya? Pnei Yeshua discusses this question at length on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis. And what emerges from the Pnei Yeshua has a certain question on that mahalach, but the original mahalach of the Pnei Yeshua is the mahalach which seems to be clearest, consistent with the Rishonim, is that ishtani liluya doesn't mean that what the pri has been transformed into has a chashivos, and therefore the newly created form is mechayev a new bracha. But says the Pnei Yeshua, the chashivos of ishtani liluya means that the pri in its original form has a chashivos, that the pri itself has a multiple number of uses. And the pri itself has a chashivos that the original pri, can be transformed into something else. And that pri is oimed to be transformed into that significant new form. And therefore the pri itself contains in it two forms and two possibilities of bracha. One is the bracha, let's say in the case of Yayin, of Boyer Pri Ha'etz on the Pri itself. But because the Pri of the Eitz of Hagefen has in it a chashivos that it can be transformed into Yayin, therefore when that Pri is transformed into Yayin, the original Pri has achieved a degree of chashivos, which was inherent in it, in its form of Pri, and therefore now that Pri itself, transformed to its completion, has its bracha. This is the way the Pnei Yeshua explains the chashivos of Ishtani Li'iluya. Ishtani Li'iluya doesn't mean that what has been created, the Bria Chadosha, so to speak, is more choshuv and therefore requires a new bracha. It means the original pri has a chashivos, that it can be transformed into a davar choshuv, and therefore when it is transformed into a davar choshuv, that original pri is mechayev a bracha chashuva. Yeshua explains this by saying that the reason why by pri hagefen has a chashivos is because all other peiros, when they are pressed into juice, the bracha becomes a shahakol because it's considered zeo ba'alma. Whereas yayin is considered, similar to Shemen Zayis, guf hapri, and therefore the chashivos of pri hagefen or pri hazayis is that it inherently has within it the capacity to be transformed into yayin or shemen, and therefore the pri itself necessitates that bracha chashuva when it achieves its shleimus. Not the new object is mechayev bracha, but the original pri has achieved a certain chashivus by being transformed into the new form. This is all mavur in the Pnei Yeshua, which we touched on the Lamed Amud base. So to summarize, Islay Alu Achina doesn't mean we've created a new object, and the new object requires its own bracha, but it means that we have reached the completion of the original pri. And the original pri now is then mechayev, in the lashon of Rabbeinu Yonah, a bracha chashua for its current state. That's the yisoid. That's mavur in the Pnei Yeshua. If im keinim hadvarim, and we assume this yisoid of the Pnei Yeshua, so then we can go on and say the following. When chitim have a maila, that they can be ishtani li'iluya. We're not discussing that pas has a bracha chashuva because when we've created pas is mechayiv a bracha chashuva. But we've said that chitim themselves have a maila, that the chashivas of a chita is that it can be transformed into pas. And therefore, when it's transformed into pas, the bracha on the chita changes to its ultimate bracha of Hamoitzi Lechem in Haaretz, or as we'll see, time allowing, from the Nachlas David, the bracha of Bar Minim Zayis. Now, when we come to discuss the bracha of Kamcha Dechiti, and what bracha Kamcha Dechiti should have, we want to now propose the following svara based on the Pnei Yeshua. And the svara is this. If the chashivos of chita is in that it can eventually be transformed into pas, and whenever the chita, similar to yayin or shemen, is then in the form of its ultimate chashivos, the pri itself is mechayev bracha. So now we could say the following. When we transform chitim into kemach, the reason why kemach should be considered ishtani li'iluya is because kemach is part of the process of creating pas. It's bringing the chita to its ilui by transforming the chita into something from which pas can be made. And therefore what we're suggesting is that the premise of the Shaklavataria of the Gemara, that kemach should be considered ishtani li'iluya, is not because kemach in and of itself inherently is more choshev. Because that's never the principle of ishtani li'iluya. Ishtani li'iluya is never based on the fact that the current form, that whatever it is mechayev a new bracha. The principle of ishtani li'iluya says that the original pri has achieved its ilui by being transformed into this. So therefore, eino chenami, we began by asking that how can it be that the Marik and Rabbeinu Yonah established that Kamcha Dechiti is considered ishtani li'iluya, if Tosfos says that Koses is a kol shekain from Kamcha Dechiti? And we asked, how can we say that it's considered an ilui if the Rif says it's clearly shaloi kaderech? The answer is, Einochanami, if the explanation and the principle of Ishtani Liluya is the new object that's created is Mechayev Bracha Einochanami. Kemach in its current form certainly is not as choshuv and is not as much of an ilui as Kaisis Chita. It's less Kederech Achila, and Taisis validly draws a kol shekain from Kemach to Kaisis. The reason why it's Ishtani Liluya is because it marks and signifies part of the ilui of the original chita on its way to be transformed into pas. So even if it's in its current form, it's not as nis'ala as kaisis chita. But the reason why the bracha should be the bracha of Ishtani Liluya is because it's part of the transformation of the chita towards becoming pas. That's the svara of the Gemara, and that's the svara of Rabbi Yehuda why there should be a din of Ishtani Liluya. Im Keinim Hadvarim, then we can explain why the Gemara chooses to parallel dafka to shemen and not to parallel to yayin. What's the Ishtani Liluya by shemen? What's the chashivos of shemen zayis? The chashivos is that the pri, like we said before, can be nigmar and transformed into shemen. But we know that when shemen has that ilui, that it's transformed in the zayis is transformed into shemen, the shemen can't be used by itself. The shemen always requires an additional step of either being consumed in an anigroin and for refuah. So shemen also is something where in its form of ilui, in and of itself, it's legreusa. Because the shemen per se, in its state as pure shemen zayis, adrabah, is legreusa. It's only when it's further enhanced by combining it with anigroin does it have the bracha of B'er Priya Eitz. Im Keinim Advarim, then the dimin of the Gemara is nifla. Yayin, in its form of yayin, is independently an ilui, not part of another step process of having to be combined or further acted on to create the ilui. Kemach is part of the process of the ilui of pas, and shemen is the ilui towards anigroin. Zog the Gemara, what's the discussion? What's the basis of the discussion of the Gemara? If kamcha dechiti should be ishtani liluya, it's a unique question where chitim have their ilui in being transformed into pas. Part of that process is forming it into kemach. So kemach represents a step in the ilui of chita, but yet it's not the final step. It's not the full ilui, because chita has to be made into an isa, and shemen has to be made into an igrain. Zok the Gemara, yain is irrelevant. Yain doesn't prove anything to the discussion of the Gemara, because we were never trying to prove that just ishtani alone is ishtani liluya. That's a Mishnah. What we're saying is that where the ishtani represents part of the process of the ilui of the original pri, but the ilui hasn't yet been concluded, is that considered ishtani liluya? Zog the Gemara, in the case of kemach, we're in the middle of the process. It's part of the formation of pas, but not completed. Shemen is also part of the process, but not yet combined with anigroin. So the same way as shemen, despite the fact that in its form of shemen doesn't have an ilui, still when combined with anigroin, it will have a bracha of B'er Priya Eitz, even though shemen in and of itself is not a nishtani liluya, so too says the Gemara kemach, even consumed raw should have the bracha of B'er Priya Hadama. It's ishtani liluya. On that, the Gemara is saying the chiluk of Hasam is liluya achrina and Hasam less liluya achrina. What's the beer in the chiluk of the Gemara? The svara of Rav Nachman is hagufa. In order to count something as an ilui, einochanami, this represents a step in the process of ishtani liluya, but because it's not yet the gemar, it's not the end of the process of ishtani liluya, we can't yet consider it as representing the ilui of the pri. Masha'enkein shemen, since it's less le'ilui achrina, so therefore it represents the original ilui of the purpose of the original ilui of the pri. Now to return to the other two questions that we asked. We had asked why the Gemara doesn't bring a raya from yayin. We've now explained that yayin is not relevant to the Gemara's discussion because yayin is the ultimate ilui. We also asked, why does the Gemara discuss kivin de ishtani b'milsekoi or not b'milsekoi? Let's just clearly say that this is ishtani liluya or not ishtani liluya. The answer is that the issue of b'milsekoi or lo b'milsekoi is exactly this point. Where something has been transformed but hasn't yet reached what represents the ultimate ilui of the pri, is that considered, since it's part of the process of the ilui, it should be considered the ilui of the pri, or it's not the ilui of the pri? Zok de Yehuda afal gav the ishtani, and therefore it's part of the ilui, as the Marik and Rabbeinu Yonah point out, is mavur in the Gemara because we're comparing it to Shem and Zayis. But you'll argue that it can't be the complete ilui because the actual ilui is represented by pas. Zok the Gemara afal gav the ishtani b'milsekoi, even though in its current state, it's not the original form of the pri, and it's no longer it's not yet the ultimate completion, but nonetheless, we see from Shemen, b'mil seikoi, it's still appropriate to make the bracha chashuva of the pri, because this does represent a specific step in the ilui of the pri. We can't just simply say ishtani liluya, because this isn't a classic sugya of ishtani liluya. This is not the issue of yayin. It's where something is being transformed, and it represents progress towards the ultimate chashivos. Shemen towards anigroin, chita towards path. Does that then represent the din of ilui, or do we say that since isle iluya achrina, therefore that is not considered ishtani liluya? And therefore we can now understand how we can paradoxically have, on the one hand, we can have that the Gemara considers it ishtani liluya, but yet Taisus draws a kavachomer to kaisis chitim. We can have on the one hand that the Rif says it's not derech achila, but yet the Gemara can call it ishtani liluya. The answer is because ishtani liluya is not related to its current form. Ishtani liluya means how much does this represent the progress of the original pri towards its ilui. So the Rif avad it's an ilui. Kamach is to make pas, and therefore it's an ilui. Reb Nachman counters and says because isle iluya achrina, therefore, we don't yet see the chashivos of the original pri being transformed, and therefore we don't have the din of ishtani liluya. Taisus is therefore saying that if we see that kemach can be considered an ilui, even though it's not the ultimate ilui, but we see that in the form of kemach, we still have the bracha on the original chita, because it's going to become kemach. So says Taisus, kol shekain, the bracha on the original chita should be the bracha of Ber Priyada. This is the Yisoid which Be'ez Hashem we want to establish. I apologize that because of technical difficulties, the shir was interrupted in the middle and we lost a number of moments to then see the Nachlas David and further Maramukemis in the Sugya, Rabbi Kiva Eger on the Teisus on Daf Lamed Ches and so on. But to conclude at this point the Chelik Halach of the shir, the Yesod Advarim which we are attempting to establish based on the Rishonim is the following. The Gemara, as Rabbeinu Yonah points out, and as is Mavur from Chuvas Marik, is discussing two nidonim. By definition, where something is ishtani, the bracha should become, according to the Marik, a shahako, similar to the din of trima. And Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder will be mashlim that in Daf Lamed Ches. The Rif argues with that and says ishtani doesn't necessarily denigrate the bracha. The discussion then of the Gemara itself, the machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yehuda, is in the din of ishtani li'iluya. And we've said that the din of ishtani li'iluya, by the virtue of the fact that the Gemara doesn't invoke the din of shemen, and we can have ishtani li'iluya, and despite that, it's ein derech achila, or Taisus understands that in terms of derech achila, kaisus chita is superior, so to speak, forces us to conclude that the issue of ishtani li'iluya is not defined by the state of the pre-now, but how much it represents the completion and the progress of the original pri. And therefore the Gemara says the same way as shemen is ishtani liluya, even though it needs to be combined with anigrain, so too kemach, even though it ultimately needs to become pas, can still be considered Ishtani Liluya. Once the Gemara establishes it's not Ishtani Liluya, then we have another question. So should the bracha now based on Ishtani be less than the bracha Bar Pri Adama? There we have, as we mentioned, the machlokes between Rashi and the Rif. Does Ishtani by definition make it lose its Teras Pri? Or according to the Rif, we now invoke the din of because it's not Derech Achila, and in absence of Ishtani Liluya, therefore the bracha will be a bracha of Shehakoel. Those are the Yesodos which Be'ez Hashem we've tried to establish in the Sugya. One benegeh to the basic machlokes between Rashi and the Rif, if Ishtani denigrates the bracha to Shehakoel, and that doesn't allow us at this point, unfortunately, but that's the discussion of the Morei Misada, bottom left of the first page of the Mara Mekaymas. And then we've discussed that a basic Yesod, based on the Pnei Yeshua and the Flamadei, that Ishtani Liluya represents the Gemara of the original Pri, and therefore the Shakla B'Tara of the Gemara is, does any step in the process, stage in the process of progressing to the ultimate Ilui, is that Mechayiv a bracha of Isla Ilui Achrina in its current state. Just to conclude with a brief Divrei Agada, we've begun now the Avodah of Chodesh Kislev. In Reb Tzadok in Pri Tzadik, in the section on the Rosh Chodesh Kislev printed in this parasha, Reb Tzadok makes an assumption that says that the same way as Yomim Tovim Doiraisa, the Yontiv is associated with the skula of the Chodesh. So, for example, Pesach, even though Pesach is on the specific Yomim of Chodesh Nisan, but we understand that Pesach is shaykh to the entire Chodesh. The Braisa Yochel Meirish Chodesh Tamad Leima Bayemahu. Chodesh Ha'aviv. So too, in the Chodesh in Matan Torah, is always meyuchas to the Chodesh Hashlishi. The Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Pezayin, Oirayon Tilisoi Biyarcha Tilisoi. Torah was nitan in the Chodesh Hashlishi. So too, the Yom Tov of Sukkot is mavur in the Midrashim, is in the same Chodesh, and the Ramban is already referring to this, is in the same Chodesh of the Chodesh of Yom Kippurim, the Chodesh Hashavi. And when the Torah introduces each one of the Moyadim, the Torah is makdim, the mispar of the Chodesh. Reb Tzadok expands this Yesod, and Reb Tzadok makes an assumption without the arichos which we've just introduced, but Reb Tzadok assumes this as a pshitos, that so too the Zmanim Kedoshim Midrabanon of Hanukkah and Purim are also Meshach Shaykhet to the Chodesh. In the case of Purim, it's very simple to prove that. We know from the Yerushalmi that the whole Chodesh is kosher, L'kriyas HaMegillah. HaChodesh Asher Nepach, in the Lashon of the Megillah. Chodesh Asher Nepach. Hanukkah, says Reb Tzadok, is also shaykh to the Iker Inyan of Chodesh Kislev. What is the Iker Inyan of Chodesh Kislev? So Reb Tzadok quotes the Lashon of the Sefer HaYetzirah. That the Sefer HaYetzirah goes through, the end of Sefer HaYetzirah goes through all the Chadashim and associates with each Chodesh a ois in the Aleph Beis and a certain form of physical activity, certain maisa that the person does begufay. So in the case of Chodesh Kislev, according to the Girsa of the Arizal and Sefer Yetzirah, there are varying Girsos and the Rishonim in this, but according to the Girsa of the Arizal and the Sefer Yetzirah, the ois that's associated with Chodesh Kislev is the ois of Samach, and the Kenegdoi is the concept of Sheina Baguf, the concept of Sheina. Reb Tzadok explains what the significance of Samach is, the connection to Sheina, and then ultimately the connection to Chodesh Kislev. And he says the following. There's a Medrash Rabbah in HaRav, where the Medrash Rabbah says that the first time in which the ois of Samach is used in the Torah is in the Yetzirah of Chava, Vayizgar Basa Tachtena, where the Rebbeinu Shalom removed the tzela and was soiger basa tachtena. Ve'im yoyma lecha adam, that it's already koydem where in describing the Nahoros who has soivev as kol eretz, Toimar Loi says the Medrash. I remember the lashon of the Medrash. As Shlomo mentioned before, I'm not home, but just if I recall the lashon of the Medrash, Toimar Loi shezeh ben Nahoros. That's not describing Adam. The first time that the oises samachin used in connection with a person is vayizgar basa tachtem. The Medrash goes on to say that the chashivus of the ois of samach, it represents the midah of the Rebbeinu Shalom soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. What we say in Asher, Pasuk in Tehillim, HBrachos is soymech l'chol hanoiflim. So Reb Tzadok then goes on to say a davar nifla. He says, an Adam functioning in the form of Shena, a person being in a form of sleep, represents Adam in a lower form than when he's active. Even though his neshama is Oila Lamala, but in terms of the Adam himself, it's a lower form. We see that from the Psukim, Ani Yeshena v'libi er. Klal Yisrael is called Yeshenim in Amitzos, Yeshnoi Am Echad Yeshenim in Amitzos. The concept of Shena always represents a person in his state of nefila. Zokt Reb Tzadok, where is it that the Torah first uses the ois of samach in connection to an Adam, representing the mid of the Rebbeinu Shalom of Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim? It's at the point that Adam Arishon was a Yoshin. The Rebbeinu Shalom was mapil tardeim on Adam and removed the tzela from which Chava was then formed. Says Reb Tzadok, the Rebbeinu Shalom's midah of Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim is most manifest and active when the Adam is a Yoshem, which means when the Adam is in a state of ruchniistic nefila, in a state of ruchniistic slumber, in a state of reduced activity, it's dafka then that the Rebbeinu Shalom most intensively is noyeg with him, with the midah of samach, with the Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. And he goes on to say is that the point of Shena, the Rebbeinu Shalom created for Adam Arishon an Ezer. That means the midah of the Rebbeinu Shalom to be soymech l'chol hanoiflim, to be an oizer, is most manifest when the oilam is in a state of Shena. Koshar in the Chodesh and the Lashon Tzevitzira ois samach, and kenegda is the midah of Shena. Samach is the midah of soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. And where is that most manifest? When the Adam is in a state of Yoshem. The midah of Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'kom, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is soymech to a Neufel, is where it's Neufel Tardim ala Adam, the Rebbeinu Shalom creates for him a Makom Fe'ezer. The connection to Chodesh Kislev, Reb Tzadok explains like this. Based on the Bach, the familiar Bach, in the beginning of Hilchas Chanukah, that Klal Yisrael returning from Bais Sheni, the binyan of Ezra, the Koyanim and Klal Yisrael as a whole lacked Mesiras Nefesh and the determination to establish Avodah, the Tairasa. The Sugya of She'ilas HaKoyanim Torah and Chagai represents the fact that the Koyanim, so to speak, and Zo'ol Mavur Mitech Lebach, when Israshel, in the Koyanim Zvizimheim and their determination to maintain Avodah in the Madrega that it should be. Zok the Bach, what was accomplished mitoich the Nes of Chanukah, mitoich the Meirois of the Me'ach Chanukah, was Klal Yisrael and the Kohen in particular re-establishing the intensity of Mesiras Nefesh that allowed them to have Avodah. Says Reb Tzadok, if that's correct, then we can go on to be mechadish that the rationale and the siba for the hanhaga, for the hashgacha, that choshech should be yored la'ilam through galus yavam. Choshech hapenei sahim zu galus yavam. The purpose of that chashecha was gufa, that through the chashecha Klal Yisrael should regain an aliyah in the Mesiras Nefesh towards Avodah. Zot Reb Tzadok, the same way as when the Adam is betardema, the Rebbeinu Shalom gives him an Ezer. It doesn't just mean that the Rebbeinu Shalom gives him an Ezer to extricate himself from the Nefila. It means Adarabah, Yerida becomes a tzerich for Aliyah. The Yerida itself becomes the means by which Klal Yisrael, or the individual, can gain a greater madrega than before the Nefila. Soymech Hashem l'chol ha'neiflim in a matzav of Sheina is kedei that the Rebbeinu Shem should provide the siyua so that the Yerida should be Terech Aliyah in the Lashon of Reb Tzadok. So too, he says, that's the limud of the entire Chodesh Kislev, where Klal Yisrael in Chodesh Kislev were moise nefesh mitoich the tsar and the choshech of the Gzeira to regain a darg of Mesiras Nefesh that they didn't have before. Adarab, it was the choshech and the intensity of the Gzeira which Labasayf brought Klal Yisrael to the point that they were moise nefesh, and therefore Adarab they regained Avodah. Mitoich the choshech, the Rebbeinu Shalom was soymech, so that the Yerida became a means for Aliyah. Zot Reb Tzadok, that's what we mean by kosher to the Chodesh Ois Samach, and that's Keneged Sheina Ba'adam. Adarabah, there are points where a person feels meruchak, he feels that was noifel olav tardema, he's in a state of choshech. But nonetheless, there's a midah of Somech Hashem L'chol HaNeiflim such that the shein on the nefila becomes the opportunity and becomes the spur for Aliyah. Rabbeinu Yonah in Shari Tshuva uses the Lashon, so he doesn't quote this, but this will finish. Rabbeinu Yonah uses the Lashon in Shari Tshuva that Yeh HaChoshech Sibas HaOira. The Choshech itself becomes the generator of light. Zot Reb Tzadok, that's the Indian of Chodesh Kislev, that the midah of the Chodesh contains both. It contains the tzara, the intensity of the Gzeira on the Mesiras Nefesh, and it then contains the Geula from it, because it's Dafka the Choshech which became the Siba of the Oira. And the means for that is because Dafka in a state of Choshech is there a midah of the Rebbeinu Shalom being Somech Hashem L'chol HaNeiflim, which means that al yedei that, Adarabah, the Choshech becomes the Siba Sa'oira, so that Klal Yisrael mitoich, the very intensity of the Gzeira itself, regained the Koach of Mesiras Nefesh, which was then, as the Bach says, the prerequisite and the cause of the Nes of Chanukah.